I normally tend to be very informal in introducing people, but tonight I decided it was a special occasion, so I wrote something to read here.
I hope it's short.
It's shorter than Fidel Castro's last speech. Yeah, it's like 3 hours and a half, so don't worry. So, bom, antes de mais nada, em português, enorme obrigado a todos vocês por estarem aqui essa noite. Eu estou muito feliz, eu gosto imensamente da Anne, tenho grande admiração por ela, e para a Fundação é um luxo tê-la aqui e poder dividir esse momento com gente que é amiga da Fundação. So why did we, the Foundation, invite Anne Applebaum to be here this evening? First, because we have great admiration for Anne's work. She's a global public intellectual with a remarkable ability to analyze contemporary events with the sensibility of a well-informed journalist and the knowledge of an accomplished historian. With the world in a state of turmoil as we have not seen in at least the last 40 years, it's hard to think of a more timely fashion occasion to talk to Anne. The second reason is because we, the Cardoso Foundation, the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation, and Anne, we share the same values and concerns. We may not see eye to eye in every issue, but what we share is bigger and more important than our subtle and nuanced center-right versus center-left type of disagreements. We share the values of liberal democracy, which, far from a perfect system, is and will always be a work in progress. We share also the concern about the global spread of autocracies. Anne has a lifelong commitment to use her passion and reason to fight for liberal democracy. So do we. She does it with great courage and clarity, either as a prolific writer of books and essays, as well as a frequent guest in top-quality podcasts and TV shows. By the way, most of Anne's books have been published in Brazil by Editora Record. The ones about the history of Soviet Union and the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, as well as the more recent ones, eloquently titled The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, and Autocracies, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Anne is everything in the digital world, but today she's here with us. The Fernando Henrique,
in real life.
In flash. The Fernando Henrique Cardoso sees this as a privilege and an honor, and I really mean it. Thank you so much for making the time to come to Brazil and share your views with our guests this evening. I would also like to thank Patricia Campos Melo for having accepted to interview Anne with me tonight. The interview is a way to start the conversation. Let us monopolize Anne's attention for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then you may join the conversation. To that end, raise your hand and ask a question, a concise one preferably. I will try to organize the sequence of questions to the best of my ability. So, Anne, once again, thank you so much. Patricia, thank you so much. Ruth, thank you so much for opening your house for this meeting tonight.
You wrote recently this article for The Atlantic about the upcoming Hungarian elections. And Flávio Bolsonaro, who's going to be the candidate, just mentioned in the CPAC in Texas that he expects the U.S. to exert diplomatic pressure during the Brazilian elections for fair elections that enforce American values, whatever that means. What is the difference? I mean, you've been covering Russian influence operations for many, many years. As of now, what is the difference in the way the U.S. is being an influence operations actor and Russia is? What are the main differences?
Well, there's still a really big difference. So the Russians have been doing this for a decade, and the Russians have, for each country, I don't actually know how much they work here. Maybe you may know that, but maybe not much. But the Russians have, for each country, they have usually their interest is in whatever is the local, whatever is divisive. This is they're mostly focused on Europe. So whatever is divisive, whatever national argument there is, they seek to make it worse. And their goal is, they have a very clear goal in Europe. I don't know what their goal would be here exactly. Maybe they have business goals. But their goal is to undermine European institutions, to destroy the European Union, and to take apart NATO. Because for the Russians, when they look at Europe, they see, when they see each country individually, they're either larger or they're equals. I mean, they can boss around the Lithuanians. They're at least one-on-one with the Germans. But when they face the European Union, they're facing an institution that's 5 times larger than they are, much richer and much better run. And so it's always been in their interest to try to undermine Europe in order to have the ability to, do more corrupt operations in Europe, to have influence inside European countries and so on. So, in each country they have a different program. So in Spain, they supported the Catalan separatists. So in France, they've put their support behind the French far right, which predates them by many decades. It's a very old part of French politics. It goes back to Vichy, and they simply support something that already exists. In Germany, they may have had a bigger role in creating the AfD, actually creating a far right political party. And they put money into internet campaigns. They pay politicians. They seek political parties and actors who will do business deals with them, and they promote or they get money to them in that way. So they've been very actively involved in a lot of countries' politics for a long time. I mean, the US has never acted like that inside Europe or inside other democracies, at least certainly not since the Cold War ended. And it doesn't have that kind of structure. I mean, we don't have teams of, the Internet Research Agency was the name of the Russian organization that created fake stories and we don't have that, as far as I know, that doesn't exist. But, it presumably could be created. I mean, it's not like it's rocket science or it's very difficult. My sense is that there are also still some divisions inside the U.S. So there's some people who still want to do normal foreign policy and have normal relations and are interested in trade. If you talk to any U.S. military leader, an admiral or a general, all of them will talk about the exercises they do with allies and alliances, and they'll talk about NATO, and they'll talk about how much they care about these traditional things. So if you go kind of one level below the White House, you'll still see a lot of normal American, European, and American, Latin American operations going that are there just the way they always were. But you do have at the top now, you have some really radical people who want to change everything. I mean, one of the things that's been most interesting to watch in the US is the degree to which some of the old tools of diplomacy, like the State Department, are now almost completely cut out of diplomacy. So all these negotiations that the US has been running with, between Russia and Ukraine or with Iran, those negotiations were being done by either the pair of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are both real estate developers, or through other strange envoys and people outside the system, very often without asking for input from the CIA, from the State Department, from intelligence. So they've been trying to run almost a kind of their own foreign policy around traditional institutions. And that's, of course, I think why they've made a lot of mistakes. I mean, I think that's the origins of the war in Iran.
What is your take about the relationship between, not the U.S. necessarily, but the inner circle around Trump and Trump himself and the Kremlin, and how that might affect the future of Europe? And will Europe rise up to the occasion, being pressed by both sides?
No, so first of all, the relation between Trump and Russia goes back to the 1980s. In the 1980s, Trump made a trip to Moscow. The Soviet Union still existed. And he came back talking about business deals, and he famously took out advertisements in U.S. newspapers saying that U.S. alliances are a waste of money and we should abandon them. Why is the U.S. wasting money on Europeans?
Back then in the 80s.
This is in the 80s. And in one of his early books, I think it's The Art of the Deal, he has a whole thing about wasting money on alliances, and even World War II. Why did we go to war in Europe? It was a great mistake. So some of this thinking goes back a long way. And then, of course, he's had a business relationship with Russia for 30 years. He's had in all kinds of different ways. Their Russian business people were part of deals that he did, and one of them bought a house from him at a very high inflated price. And the assumption is at some points in his career that he feels some gratitude to the Russians because they helped him. The other maybe the most important point is that he had a business. His business model was that he built buildings. Either he built them or someone built them and they had his name on them, and then he sold condominiums in those buildings. And something like between a fifth and a quarter of all the condominiums that he sold, this is in the 90s and 2000s, went to anonymous companies, so shell companies, so they were sold to people whose names we don't know. And this was at a time when a lot of people from the former Soviet world were buying property as a way of getting money out of Russia, buying property in places like Miami and New York, as well as London. So he has this long-standing respect for the Russians. He seems to have a personal admiration for Putin. Trump is somebody who he's somebody who doesn't want to have any constraints, and he sees Putin as someone who can act. He doesn't have to worry about Congress. He doesn't have to worry about the law. He doesn't have to worry about journalists. He's not constrained by anything. And Trump admires that kind of unconstrained, essentially authoritarian power. And it's a kind of power he would like to have. And he feels resentful and angry when he comes up against barriers inside the US system. And this certainly, and he's now surrounded by some people, this was not true in his first term, he's now surrounded by some people who are willing to help him break those barriers, which was not so easy before. And so there's some combination of those things make him admire Russia. There may be, there's constant speculation, there has been for 10 years about some deeper, some blackmail or something, but I don't think you need that actually to explain his behavior. As for Europeans, so this is a really, I don't know how clear it is from here, this is a really dramatic moment in Europe. It's very disorienting for a lot of Europeans. The realization that the United States is no longer a reliable ally, and some people fear a bit more than that, the U.S. may actually be a hostile power, is kind of mind-bendingly difficult. I was in Denmark about 6 weeks ago, and you have to think about what the Danes went through this year. So the Danes came to believe in January, for reasons that both public and private statements of Trump, they came to believe that it really was possible that there would be a U.S. military invasion of Greenland. And they began to prepare for a U.S. military invasion of Greenland. What did that mean? That means they got their soldiers ready to kill Americans. They got ready maybe to shoot down American planes, I'm just guessing. They got ready to blow up. There's only a couple of airports in Greenland, and apparently you can't land anywhere else because it's ice and rocks. So they got ready to blow up the airports. So they were preparing for a real invasion with, people dying. And then it didn't happen, and Trump gave a strange speech at Davos in which he somehow mixed up Greenland and Iceland a few times, and he moved on. No, he really did. Okay, and then it was over, but they haven't recovered yet. That was imagine preparing your military to fight the United States if you're Denmark. It's a country of 5 million people. It has a very close relationship to the United States. There are a number of big Danish companies. There's a big shipping company called Maersk. There's a number of, they invented some of the the new weight loss drugs, Novo Nordisk. They have huge investments in the United States. Enormous business up, and the U.S. has business investments in Denmark. And they have a long history. They were one of the founding members of NATO. And Greenland has always been part of the NATO planning and operations and so on. And to suddenly have to see the U.S. as a hostile power was very shocking to to them, but they're not the only ones. I mean, the part of the fear is now, and this I hear constantly, is the fear that Europe is over-reliant on US technology. So finally, that wasn't understood even 2 years ago. That wasn't understood as a security issue or a political problem. It's okay, the US makes better technology, the US built the internet platforms, we'll use them. And now that's understood as possibly a great political weakness. And this, maybe you have a parallel story here. And there are a number of conversations I'm aware of about changing the way European tech financing works, moving onto different kinds of platforms. There's a move to create some alternative social media platforms. There's been a really profound shift, and I hear this not just from politicians, but from European business. German business people have got the message, and they're afraid that now it's time to make sure they have their own platforms and their own technology. And the difficulty in Europe is that, you have more than 24 countries, you have different regulatory systems, different politics. They can coordinate trade, and they have done so successfully for a long time. But there's still national interests and national champions in business. And I don't think we know yet whether they can build alternative tech and alternative defense industry, but they are going to try. And the defense spending is real. I mean, there's different arguments about how well they're doing it, but the amount of money now going into both traditional defense and now the drone industry is large and significant. And so they are aware of the problem in a way that they weren't even 3 years ago, and they are and very conscious. And I'm one of the things I'd love to hear from you all is whether you're going through a similar process of thinking here. I mean, you're different. You're not an security dependent ally the way the European countries are.
It's a niche discussion so far.
Yeah.
And we are deeply divided, although we are one country.
Yes.
Which is different from the situation in
Well,
Europe.
the European countries are also divided, and actually the same divide between people who want an alliance with the MAGA movement and people who don't exists in almost every European country. And in some countries it's quite important. In Romania, for example, it's quite important. Very important Romanian far right, which is closely linked to people around Trump. In Poland, there's a part of the Polish far right also closely linked. I don't know, I mean, the French far right is more complicated because historically the French far right was anti-American, and so now what do?
I think inside the Brazilian government there's a discussion about tech decoupling and tech sovereignty.
Yeah.
For instance, because of the Cloud Act that offers a backdoor for the US,
Right.
which is ironic because the US had people here telling us back in the Biden administration against the 5G, against Huawei,
Right.
they would get them backdoor. So now there's a discussion, but I think it's a niche thing, but the need to not to be so vulnerable to American tech. Can I ask one more question, you think?
Of course, as many as you
I was
want.
just wondering about the US democracy. What do you see as the point of no return? Is it like actually meddling in the midterm elections, or?
I mean, so there is never a point of no return. I mean, actually, one thing you learn about politics if you watch it long enough is that there are cycles and things do change. I mean, Hungary, for example, for those of you who don't know, I mean, this is a country where you had a democratically elected leader, legitimately elected, who very slowly, in his case, took over the institutions of the state. He took over the judiciary, the bureaucracy. He used various state means to empower and enrich oligarchs who were close to him. They bought up the media, the entire Hungarian media. There is no Hungarian television that's not controlled by the ruling party. He controlled so many institutions that it felt impossible for anybody else to win. And there is now an election, and there is an opposition party, and at least in the opinion polls, it's ahead. And we're about to find out whether they can win. So there are always things happen that there's no such thing as there's the famous Martin Luther King quote about the arc of history bending towards justice. actually, there is no arc of history. It doesn't bend in one way or the other, and it can always be altered. In the US, you have had many of the same things that have happened in Hungary have also happened in the US, only much faster. And what the Trump administration did in the first year was really launch a kind of full speed assault on the same kinds of institutions in a way that Americans were unprepared for because we had some hints of it in previous administrations actually, but never at this scale or with this speed. And one of the examples that the MAGA movement and Doge and others were studying was Hungary. Which institutions did they conquer? How did they take, Orban took over the media not by having censorship, but by having wealthy people close to him buy up media properties. And it looks like Trump is trying to do that in the United States too. So they have made an effort. I mean, the assault on the bureaucracy is real. I lived part of the time in Washington, and just random people. I mean, I have a next door neighbor who works for the Department of Education, and I know lots of people who are in different parts of the federal government, and the transformation of their lives and their jobs is remarkable. I mean, my neighbor says no one talks to anyone else at work because you don't know who's on which side. And you have this, for me, it's very strange because I wrote so much about the history of Central Europe. And in fact, I wrote a book about the communist takeover of Poland, East Germany, Hungary in the 1940s. And some of the emotions and some of the descriptions are very similar. I mean, obviously there's no violence. It's not in that sense, it's very different. But, the inside a bureaucracy, when you need to conform to a new power and change the way things are going, the way people's emotions and reactions are quite, some people conform and some people can't, and so they quit. And so there's a lot of drama. And Washington has really been like that over the last year. What you are beginning to see now is a lot of pushback, very important pushback from courts, not just the Supreme Court, but lower courts. I mean, actually Saturday, sorry, I'm losing track of days. That No Kings March, I mean, I don't know how much media coverage it got here. That was the largest march ever in American history. And it wasn't just Washington and New York and Los Angeles, it was 3,000 or 4,000 different small marches in different places, and the numbers when you add up are way higher than anything we've ever seen before. I have some mixed feelings about those marches because the way they're organized is very chaotic, but that one of the upsides is that you can join them almost whatever your political views are. No Kings is a pretty broad church. You can be No Kings far left, and you can be No Kings center right, and you can be No Kings ex-Republican. You just don't like kings. We joked with my husband, and actually I won't tell this joke, but how do Europeans feel about it? Well, what if you're a monarchist? There was a No Kings March in London, and people were like, well, I don't know. we like our king. I mean, constitutional monarchy has its advantage. I mean, if you've lived in a constitutional monarchy and you've lived in a place where they have an elected presidency and a parliament, you can see the advantages of constitutional monarchy. But that's a different conversation. So you have that, and you have one of the advantages of midterms is that it's 50 different elections in each different state. Each one is run differently. The states run their own elections. We don't have a central federal electoral system, which has its advantages and disadvantages, but it means it's very hard to control it. It also means that there is no need right now for a single person to unify the Democrats or whatever you call it now, because it's not just Democrats. It's Democrats plus the ex-Republicans who object to the Trump's assault on democracy. And so you're seeing the emergence in particular states of quite powerful and important local leaders, some of whom are more conservative, some of whom are more liberal. I mean, the really good example of that was during the last November's election, sort of off-year election, when you had Mamdani winning an election in New York City, and then you had Abby Spanberger, who's quite a conservative Democrat, winning as governor of Virginia. She's an ex-CIA, very centrist person. And also the governor of New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill, is a former Navy pilot, also veteran, conservative. So you have a lot of very different kinds of people who are able to win, running in different places, and so that's also an advantage. I suppose there are a couple of questions about whether the midterms will be fair to watch. One is there is an attempt, I think it's going to fail, to change the voting laws at the federal level to make it more difficult for some people to vote, so that requiring people to have essentially passports or birth certificates, which is really crazy because you have to have an ID now. You can have a driver's license. But there are something like 60% of Americans don't have passports, and not everybody has their birth certificate. And I would think a lot of Republicans don't have birth certificates.
So that would be a voter suppression.
It's just voter suppression. It would be a massive voter suppression. Feels to me now like it's not going to pass, but they are trying to pass it. There's also been an effort from the federal government to collect voter data from states, and there might be attempts to purge people from the voter rolls, which has happened in a couple states in the past. But I don't know. But there are ongoing lawsuits. Almost all the states who were asked to do this have said no. So there will be games played. I mean, there was an attempt to gerrymander to change the voter boundaries. But again, these are tricky. So they succeeded in Texas. In Texas, they redrew the borders, and now it's not clear whether that was a good idea, because when you redraw them, you make some formerly Republican districts more centrist. And now they might, if there's a big Democratic landslide, they could lose some of those seats. Anyway, this is more nuanced than you need. But the point is that, the midterms are very important because I do think that if there is a Republican-controlled House and Senate at the time of the next presidential election, then I would expect difficulty confirming a democratically elected president, because that was, of course, what they tried in 2020. Mm-hmm. And next time around, they would be better prepared. So it is important that the Democrats win at least the House.
All right.
So that's probably a longer answer than you wanted.
One final question. Then Fernando first and Felipe right after. And Maria Hermínia. All right. I'll write down your names. It's about the big tax. How do you fit them in this picture, right? Big tax alliance with the MAGA movement or Trump. What kind of alliance is this? How far it goes? How does that influence U.S. soft intervention in elections abroad?
Anti-regulation agenda too.
So you probably know more about this than I do. So it's true that Silicon Valley big companies, to the extent that they had any politics at all, because these are mostly very apolitical people. These are engineers who dropped out of college. To the extent that they had any politics, they were kind of more or less aligned with the Democrats, because a lot of the people who work in those companies are. And it's clear that toward the end of the Biden administration and even during the campaign, and then certainly after Trump won, many of them saw in Trump an opportunity to push for an agenda of no regulation, an opportunity to get U.S. government investment or money in some of their products. I mean, this is most notable with Elon Musk. The Starlink and the SpaceX have enormous, important Pentagon and big government contracts. I mean, they did before, but now they do again. And there's a part of that community there are people who are openly scornful of and openly anti-democratic. I mean, Peter Thiel is somebody who says he doesn't like democracy, and he doesn't think people should have the vote, and he thinks that he has an elitist view of the world in which a few people should make decisions and most people shouldn't have influence. He doesn't think women should have influence, among other things. So that's about half in fact, it's 51% of the population. So some of them have a very aggressively anti-democratic agenda. Some of them are interested in avoiding regulation. And some of them are interested in government money, which they saw was going to be easier to get. I mean, this is something we haven't talked about yet, which is the enormous conflicts of interest and actually outright corruption of this administration, which is on a scale we've never had before in American history. And again, it's happened so fast that I don't think most people are oriented to the level of it. And so for all those reasons, they kind of jumped on, they all jumped on the bandwagon. And some of them are a part of foreign policy in the sense that this anti-regulatory agenda is something they would like to enforce elsewhere. And so, for example, certainly in the European Union, I mean, really the only institution in the world right now that is able to regulate US tech companies is the European Union, because it's big enough, the market's large enough, and they have the regulatory capacity to do it. And that, if you want an explanation as to why Elon Musk supports the same far-right parties and movements that Putin does, that's why. Because they are also interested in undermining that, those institutions. And here they may well have the same agenda. Yeah. I mean, anywhere where because Brazil, I mean, anywhere where they face a genuine regulatory threat, they're interested in how they can overcome that politically. And in the past, they didn't necessarily have the U.S. government on their side, in doing that, and now they do.
All right. Fernando Lutemberg, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hi. We're very glad that you agreed to be with us. It's a real honor for us to have you here. And remember that 2 years ago, approximately, Professor Steven Levitsky was here with us at the foundation, and he kind of made a comparison between US and Brazil, which country had been more efficient in confronting leaders who played hardball against democracy.
And Brazil won.
And Brazil won.
Yeah.
Based on the electoral court, based on the Supreme Court, and I think even with the issues that we have with the Supreme Court here, I don't know how much you're following that. I think it's a consensus that it played a very important role in stopping authoritarianism to be installed in power here in Brazil. I'd like to hear your comments about the American Supreme Court. So all of us who studied in law schools about Marbury versus Madison or U.S. versus Nixon and other cases where checks and balances were so important, and we saw at least in the first year of the current administration, a very open posture to everything that the administration wanted to do, with the exception of the tariffs decision, more recent, that they say no taxation without representation. This is too much. Do you think this is a new trend, or it's only one episode that won't repeat itself?
So as you know, those of you who know the U.S. system know that it takes a long time for cases to get to the Supreme Court. So there may well be other issues that the court will decide against Trump, but they haven't reached the court in that form. And some of the lower courts have blocked things, and there's just something I happen to know about, which is the Trump administration under the leadership of Carrie Lake, who is somebody who twice failed to win office in Arizona. She was put in charge of the U.S. foreign broadcasting, which is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and a group of other broadcasters. And she decided that her agenda was to dismantle it. Just literally fire everybody. And the court, a federal court, has just blocked that and told her she didn't have the right to do it because she didn't have the correct legal status, and because these institutions were created by Congress, and she didn't have the right to. And literally, in the last few weeks, has said she has to. I mean, I'm not sure what will happen next, but you have had a number of very big cases that have been decided by the courts, where the courts have blocked things. And so I don't think the courts are useless. I mean, there are a couple of things that really happened before Trump was elected that matter a lot. One is the Supreme Court, the decision to allow, essentially to take the barriers off campaign financing. This was a Supreme Court decision from some years back. It's called the Citizens United decision. And that decision is one of the, I think this is one of the big dividing lines. I don't know how it works here, actually, but one of the big dividing lines, certainly between the US and European democracies. Like, no European democracy has a system where anybody can spend anything as much as they want on an election campaign, and people are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on elections. Only the US has that. So my husband is a Polish politician, as some of you might know, and he ran a campaign a few years ago for the European Parliament, and the upper spending limit that he had, I think it was something like $35,000, which is, in the US, that's lunch.
Here, this is peanuts here. This is peanuts here. I mean, for a campaign,
Even though there's no...
you wouldn't be elected a councilwoman or a councilman in São Paulo with such an electoral budget. I mean, it's...
there are a lot of, maybe he didn't have to spend as much because he's well known in his constituency. I don't know. But anyway, that was his official limit and he didn't overspend it. And most countries, the Germans, I looked at this at one point. I didn't look at Brazil or South America, but I looked at Europe, and most European countries have electoral law regulations. They have campaign spending limits. They have some advertising limits. Some countries have rules that say you can't campaign in the last 24 hours. Poland has a rule like that. And of course, all of by comparison, the U.S. elections are now just free-for-alls. Anybody can spend anything. Theoretically, there are still some limits, but there are most that you can get around them. And so that was a decision that is an older one that I think is part of the explanation for how we got to where we are, and that's a previous court decision. And of course, the other decision is the decision that the president has essential immunity for whatever he does, and that's anathema. That's not true here. That's not true in France. There are presidents all over the world go to jail. And in the United States now, it'll be very hard for any president to go to jail for anything, including corruption. Those things, that decision in particular, I think, felt like it just gave the president a green light to do whatever he wanted. There may be the tariffs case was very important because not just because it blocked this crazy thing where the president just wakes up in the morning and he feels like having a tariff and so he has it, or he doesn't like the Swiss president and so he has an extra tariff on Switzerland. That was the real thing that happened. Or he doesn't like Lula, and so he does 50% on Brazil. That's so clearly not in America's interest. It's so clearly unconstitutional in the sense that in the U.S. system, tariffs are a tax, and Congress has the power to tax, and Congress decides about budgets. And it was never supposed to be that tariffs were in the whim of a president who uses them for his own personal psychological or political needs. That's not what tariffs are for. But in the language that in the decision, there is some quite strong language, including from some of the conservative justices, about the power of Congress, referring back to the Constitution and so on. So it may be that they decide other cases down the line. And as I say, the lower level federal courts, some of them have been quite good. So I wouldn't give up on them completely. There are, it is a conservative court, and there are at least two justices on the court who I think are, they're not, historically in the United States, a conservative judge if you did conservative jurisprudence, that meant that you were a, constitutional originalist. You went back and you reread the document. You looked at the original debate in 1789. You reread the transcripts from Philadelphia. And that what it meant to be a conservative jurist was that you were very loyal to the Constitution, not that you were a partisan Republican. And there are at least two justices now on the court who I think are just partisan Republicans now. And further down in the system, there are now a few judges also who are. And that's also, it's not unheard of in the US system, but it's not how it's supposed to work. You can have conservative and liberal judicial views without being loyal to the person in power. That's not what the court is supposed to be. Courts never work exactly the way they're supposed to work anywhere. But.
Felipe.
No, thank you, Anne. First thing, I just want to tell you...
In Polish, please.
Sorry?
In Polish.
I thought we forbade Polish.
Yeah.
That's for tomorrow. And Sergio asked you, why did you come to Brazil? It just reminded me that during the Fernando Henrique Cardoso period, a lot of people saying, well, we should take more protagonism in the U.S. U.S. is not paying attention to Brazil. And Fernando was always saying that, no, let's him forget us.
Benign, the so-called benign the neglect.
Yes.
Benign neglect is the...
So, well, but I just want to, you didn't mention once China. And I was starting to think, you are trying to look what happened in Europe regarding the US, the new situation with Russia, and trying to see whether what's going on in Brazil regarding more or less the same focus. I think that I just wanted to think that what we are seeing in Europe is a much worse situation with the Russian crisis, let's say, and Ukraine. That was before the invasion. Europe was exactly in the same, had a big problem between US and China, a technological problem, as you mentioned. Russia was not a problem. It was a benefit. You had the gas, the energy. And that's a big difference with Brazil, actually. Europe didn't have energy, but it had Russian energy. That was fine. And the problem was China. Now they don't have the energy, and they have to spend money in defense, not from China, from Russia, and as you say, maybe from the US, which is crazy, but this is so. So the problem, Europe has this second problem. It's
Yes,
worse
it does.
case. It's even worse. Regarding us, I think we are exporting energy, so we are fully. And we don't have any problem with China. 70% of our trade is with China. And we don't have a technological problem because we don't have aspiration to be on the forefront of technology. So it's a little bit much different. And but I wanted to hear what you think about these things.
So, first of all, China and Russia are effectively allies in Europe. I mean, Russia would not be able to continue the war in Ukraine if it didn't have de facto Chinese support. And we understand that. You know, Russia had drones from Iran. It has had troops from North Korea. It has components and parts and essentially economic support from China. If China wanted Russia to end the war, it probably could. I mean, so actually that's one of the we're in a strange moment now where the US, which actually has less and less influence on the war, US isn't supplying any weapons to Ukraine, or almost none, or any financing, and actually Europe is financing the whole war. And yet the U.S. is the power it's happening because the only power the Russians will talk to is the U.S. because they think the U.S. is more favorable. But actually the country that could end the war is China. So that's a strange circumstance. China is also, Europeans understand that the Chinese have some malign interests in Europe, and I think probably here too. So they're very interested in collecting data. Security data of all kinds. They are building their AI on the world's data that they collect in various ways. And they collect it through owning companies and through owning ports and infrastructure. And Europeans understood that and have become very nervous about how much, it's not just pure, pro-American politics that made Europeans hesitant about Huawei. It was also the fear that the Chinese would use their access to European telecoms and tech systems in order to collect data about Europe and penetrate, use it essentially to spy on them. And so that remains. That's still part of the conversation. And when Europeans talk about wanting to have tech sovereignty, it's also about having distance from China, not just from the US. At the same time, it is such a bizarre world where, the Chinese pretend, the Chinese who don't have rule of law, are now posing as this great, power that respects law and so on. And the environment and so on. Right, exactly. and I think, like, the Mark Carney has been to China, Macron has recently been to China, Merz has met with the Chinese. I mean, you are now seeing everybody saying, okay, we can't be over-reliant on the U.S. We need to have a good trading relationship with China. So everybody's repairing what you're watching is a kind of geopolitical rebalancing. But that doesn't mean that this original problem of fear of Chinese ambition has completely gone away. And there is a lot of anxiety about Taiwan, not just because of because of Taiwan as a democracy, but also because of Taiwan's importance to tech and to chips and so on. So China isn't seen as a kind of benign alternative. It's seen as someone you necessarily are going to trade with, and we're going to, and I think European trade with China is going up, but but people are still wary of certain kinds of Chinese investments and relations. That's the best I could explain it.
Well, thank you for sharing your ideas with us. I had a question about China. I would like to understand what the Trump administration, how the Trump administration is dealing with China, because when we went to United States under Biden, everybody around Biden was talking about China.
Yeah.
That was the conversation.
Also in the first Trump administration.
Yeah. And what's happening now? This is my first question. The second one is a different one. What is the importance of the international networks of extreme right like CPAC in this system? And they are important. They are some kind of marginal activity.
So those are two different questions.
Yes, two different.
So China it's very peculiar. There are people who joined the Trump administration because they thought right now we're going to really push back against China. And actually that hasn't happened. Partly it was, there was the original tariff placed on China that resulted in the Chinese boycotting the sale of rare earths that I think woke people up to the idea that it might not be that. And one of the things you're watching right now is the United States, or some in the United States, learning what the limits of their ability to affect the world is. I mean, you're seeing it in Iran right now. Maybe you can't organize, maybe you can't affect change on the ground, even with the highest tech bombing campaign there is. And maybe you can't change China's attitudes just through a tariff if the Chinese have other things that you need. And so I think there was initial more wariness about China. I mean, I was told by someone a month ago that the Trump administration had been hoping this year to have some kind of big breakthrough with China. There were a couple of meetings with the Chinese that were planned. It may be that Iran, the war, puts that off or delays it. I mean, I think a little bit like Putin, Trump is the first American leader who admires Xi and wants to be like him. And he likes to see himself in the company of those kinds of leaders because that's what that's how he sees himself. And so I think he wanted some kind of big summit. I think he was, I may be wrong, so don't quote this, but I think he was planning to go to China quite soon. So he, and this has been a very strange moment for all the China hawks who went to work for him and who worked for him in the last administration, because he doesn't seem to be interested in pushing back against China, and nor does he. And he's very careful when he talks about Taiwan. He's actually less defensive of Taiwan than Biden was. So that's a very, it's still an open question. What exactly do? I mean, again, you're seeing the U.S. hitting limits of its power, and it may be that its power in China is limited. I mean, there are a lot of things. There are a lot of ways in which the United States is losing ground to China very quickly. I mean, this business of attacking universities, cutting science funding, we haven't even talked about that yet. That's another part of their assault on the kind of institutions that create knowledge and data and facts in America. They are assaulting those as well. just at the moment when the Chinese are accelerating their investments and are beginning to pull ahead in a lot of academic and scientific areas. And I've been hearing this thing about who's ahead in AI, the US or China. I've been hearing it for many years, and I don't know the answer, but certainly the Chinese are in the same league and developing very, very rapidly as well. And so the idea that the US will always be ahead of China technologically, I don't think you can take that for granted anymore. That could change. I mean, as for the international, I mean, they're sort of different. I wrote a book about the international relations of autocracies, but you're asking about these far right parties, this, the MAGA movement and the international right. Sorry? CPAC. CPAC. So in some places it matters, and in some places it doesn't.
Explain to all what CPAC.
Okay, so CPAC used to be an annual meeting of American conservatives, and it was just the Republican Party. Like Mitt Romney went, and ordinary Republican. Sorry.
They had the straw poll.
Yeah. It was an ordinary. It was just a meeting of conservative. It was just a conservative annual conference. And I knew lots of people I knew went, and it was a place you went because that's where the conservatives went. And there was nothing especially either interesting or dangerous about it. In the last few years, it has changed. And CPAC is now actually, it's actually a business. It's become a business essentially owned by the radical part of the party, not the conservatives. These aren't really conservatives, the MAGA people. They're not conservative in any traditional sense. They're radicals who want very radical change. And it's become a business that they run. And they run, you can pay to have a CPAC come and do an event in your country. And so in Poland, for example, CPAC was invited to do an event a week before the second round of our presidential election. And so they invite CPAC in, and CPAC brings, it's kind of like the circus comes to town, and they bring some Trump officials, and they bring, some other far right wingers, and they do, they do events. You have them here too. So
Eduardo Bolsonaro was the one who
that's right.
brought CPAC.
That's right. So Bolsonaro brought CPAC here, and the Polish far right brought it to Poland, and Orban brought it to Hungary, and they've just had an American one in Texas. I think there was one in Mexico. There have been several. And it sort of depends on, they're a business, it's a business that you pay them and they come. And you pay them, their people also use the CPAC network to get access to the Trump administration, and that's also money, you pay for that. Maybe in some places they have influence. I don't know, did it matter in Poland that they were there a week before the election? Maybe to some people it did, because it gave some credibility to the Polish far-right presidential candidate, that, I don't know, Kristi Noem came. She's the one who shot her dog, and dogs are very popular in Poland, so there were a lot of jokes about it. But, it didn't seem to me very important, but then I'm not really the right audience. And so maybe to some people it gave extra credibility to that candidate, because he, Americans came and supported him. CPAC has just had an event in Hungary to support Viktor Orban's election. I'm sure there will be a CPAC event here this year to do the same thing. But it's a form of political advertising. It's called something else, and it's described as a conference. But the point of it is to, then you get the team together. You get Orban and Le Pen and Nigel Farage, and you get them to come and make speeches in favor of your candidate, and maybe it helps them win. I don't know. When I was in Hungary last week, people didn't seem to think it was going to matter very much. Do ordinary Hungarians care very much about Marine Le Pen and what she has to say? Probably not. But it's a form of giving geopolitical credibility to your insane political candidate, basically.
You wrote in a recent article, if I got it right, that Trump does not seem to understand well the consequence of his acts.
Yes.
So my question is, does he have an inner circle, people who can actually influence him In other words, how is his decision-making process?
So this is very hard
No,
for people.
no. Two questions at a time. Yeah. Sorry.
Mine is actually connected. Such a treat
Good.
to have you. Thank you so much.
It's about her favorite color.
Yes, the
yeah.
same
Okay.
thing.
Good.
My question is about the war in Iran and how you think it will affect the MAGA base, right? It's such a betrayal of everything that Trump stood for
Everything.
from the outset, right? Another intervention in the Middle East. And his base is really feeling the consequences in terms of higher energy prices. And we're seeing, Tucker Carlson and others openly criticizing him for that, while the base seems fairly united still or supportive of him. How do you think MAGA will evolve from this, or are you expecting?
To connect the two questions, I mean, Trump's base is learning something that's been clear to lots of other people for a long time. Trump himself doesn't have a strategy. He doesn't have a ruling theory. He doesn't have a geopolitical plan. He's somebody who thinks in the moment. So what is good for me right now? And that's why, whether he's sitting next to the president of Ukraine, whether he's talking to a journalist, whatever situation he's in, his instinct is, I need to be the winner right now. And whether that has longer term consequences that are bad, he doesn't care. So, probably it wasn't good for him to attack the president of Ukraine. I mean, probably it's not good for him to say foul things to journalists. It's probably not good, but he doesn't think about the further consequences of what he does. And it was the same with the decision to invade Iran or whatever we're doing in Iran, bombing Iran. It was, is this going to make me look good right now? And someone around him convinced him that it would. Whether it was Netanyahu or somebody else, I don't know. And so he doesn't think in the way you assume people in that kind of role think. I will do X and then Y will happen, or if I offend this person, then people who like that person won't like me. He doesn't think like that. It's about him. Am I winning? Am I in charge? Is this good for my financial interests? Is it good for my political interests right now? And so it's very hard for people to accept that. I find people want, because he's the president, like he has to have a strategy, but I really don't believe he does. There are people around him who have strategies. For example, somebody wrote the president's national security strategy, which was very clear about no wars in the Middle East. I mean, it barely mentioned the Middle East. And we all wrote long articles about the national security strategy, but actually, did Trump even know what was in it? Maybe not. No. No, I'm not. I mean, he may never have seen it. So there are different people around him who have different strategies, and some of what you see when he says contradictory things is you're hearing the different factions arguing with each other. He listens sometimes to Steve Witkoff, who, as I said, is a real estate investor with no experience in Iran at all of any kind. Knows nothing about, probably never heard of the Strait of Hormuz before the war started. He has those people around him. He has some more clever people around him. Who he's listening to at any given moment, I don't know. I mean, there are people who talk about manipulating him. So Lindsey Graham, who's a U.S. senator, has spoken about how you need to get Trump to do things. And he offered Netanyahu advice, he said, about how to persuade Trump. And Steve Witkoff was heard on a phone call telling Putin, or somebody who worked for Putin, how Putin can manipulate Trump. And so people know he can be manipulated. And they all try to do it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the moment, in any given moment, he can say anything. And so it's very hard to predict. What the MAGA, I think an important thing to understand about Americans, and this is probably true of most countries, is something like 60% of Americans do not read journalism of any kind. Not right-wing, not left-wing, not Fox News, not CNN, like nothing. So they don't have any day-to-day information at all about the Iran war or what we're doing in Brazil or anything. And whatever political information they get it from, health podcasts, from weightlifting podcasts from their cousin, from something they read on Facebook, from, from the atmosphere, from TikTok, I don't know. And so expecting them to have clear opinions about what the president is doing, I think is probably wrong. And this is something, by the way, that the Republicans understood quite well in 2024. And a lot of their campaigning efforts went not to kind of traditional political ads, but to trying to reach people. Joe Rogan is the most obvious one, but it wasn't just Joe Rogan, reach people who had weightlifting podcasts, because, that's what people were listening to, or popular video gaming podcasts.
I listen to a lot of them.
You listen to a lot of them. Yeah, I listen to the cooking podcast. No, but it's actually I wrote a cookbook, so I did. That shouldn't be a joke. And so that's why these numbers don't move very much. So there's whatever it is, 40% of Americans voted for Trump, and then they haven't thought about it since then. And if you push them and ask them, if they notice that oil prices are going up and things aren't getting better, and they probably lost their health care because of, then they'll begin to react. But don't expect them to react to the news from Iran, because they aren't listening to it. That would be my guess. And I think it's probably more true in most places than we think.
So, and thank you so much. I was just wondering the way that Trump is dealing with civil society, like what's happening now in the US for us is a big deja vu, and where we are here is a deja vu as well, because we've seen what can come as civil society in this country. We've been through a lot, the civil society in the US as well. But here, we actually, I think, were responsible as a larger group, together with the Supreme Court, to push back. But the Supreme Court is in a different situation today than it was before. But also, I think the breaches, for instance, if we classify these criminal organizations as terrorists and other things that are coming, will make our life much, much harder. And they can criminalize us much faster. And I'm seeing the US, let's say the assault on the foundations, everyone migrating to Europe. This also affects civil society here and elsewhere. So the aid moving to defense. So there is a weakened civil society, not only in Brazil, but in the world, given everything that is happening. So how do you see this in the US, the role of civil society fighting at Trump too? But just linked to this, and I understood and I agree with the geopolitics, let's say, analysis of Trump. I mean, he lives in the moment, but there is also election at the UN this year, and our hope, let's say, this is the moment for a Brazilian Latin American woman to be the next Secretary General, and here we are. So how lucky are we? But that's what we would like. And we just saw in Chile, the withdrawal of Bachelet candidacy, Brazil had supported. So do you think, given the Board of Peace, given everything that is happening, that Trump will care about this election at the UN? And if so, how? I was in the room when the Board of Peace was established with Orban, all those guys. That was quite scary, even if it was a spectacle. But how could they interfere in a very already suffering organization?
I mean, I don't think
you already have two questions.
Right. Okay. So about the UN, I mean, I don't think Trump himself cares at all. I mean, maybe if it was a woman who had said something mean about him, or he saw something on Fox News that was unpleasant, he might say something ugly. Like, I can easily imagine that. I mean, would he stop it? I don't know how much power the U.S. has in the UN, how much the U.S. is still funding the UN. I mean, the UN is very dysfunctional, and not only because of Trump. I mean, it was dysfunctional before he was elected because, because of Russia's behavior in Ukraine, because China is, doesn't try to solve problems at all. Because of this, because the Security Council the permanent members are so unrepresentative of the world. I mean, it's a very strange Security Council now. It's stranger every year. And it's funny, I wrote a piece last year about Sudan, and part of the piece was about how this breakdown of the international system means that what feels like it should have been a solvable problem, this is the civil war in Sudan, can't be solved because there's just no one to do it anymore. Anyway, that's an aside about the UN. So I don't know. It's hard for me to predict. I mean, if someone who he found really objectionable were named, maybe he would say something, but it's more likely that they wouldn't stop it. But, who knows? I mean, civil society, depends what you mean. If you mean by civil society, the old meaning, ordinary people participating in political life. I mean, in the United States, like as you saw on Saturday, those numbers are going up.
No, let's say more organized groups.
If you mean organize, the kind of organized groups and democracy organizations that the U.S. historically supported, for the moment that support is very low. And this is actually something I was talking about in Romania. A lot of those groups and organizations and kind of judicial watch organizations and people who were doing government watchdog work in a country like Romania were funded either by the National Endowment for Democracy or by USAID. And they all have had funding cuts. And I don't see USAID money coming back anytime soon. Once that huge chunk of money was gone, I don't know who's going to argue for it to be built up again. Maybe some of it will come back in different ways, but so I don't know. The U.S. as a source of that kind of support is probably gone for a long time, and so we have to hope for local, other sources of support.
So more like the impact in the U.S. as well for that, because here we understand, but for the civil society in the U.S. vis-a-vis what's happening, just like to see.
It is. I mean, there is less money, and there's more anxiety about giving money. Just a random example. I have a fairly wealthy friend who gives a lot of money to. I think it was money. If I'm remembering correctly, she had made a big donation to the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, and her accountant flagged it on her tax form when he saw it, and he said, "Are you sure you want to do that? Because that's the kind of thing that could get your taxes examined," which is something no one had ever said to her before. The idea that you would donate money to a liberal organization and that would be a problem I never heard anyone say that. And so there is a lot more anxiety about that kind of giving, and much more, and people who do it are much quieter about it than they were. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's weakening in the U.S. too. Although it's, the original definition of civil society wasn't just about organizations that need funding. It was also about public participation, and that I think is going up. So.
The Carney quest for the mid-sized nations to get together, and the apathy, or is there apathy of the European population to get together, given this extraordinary environment where there's U.S., China, Russia? I mean, what's happening?
So yes, there is. Everybody listened to Carney's speech. It was really important. People still talk about it all the time. It's a kind of touchstone. I mean, it's funny because other people had also said similar things, but somehow he said it at the right moment, and because it was such a contrast with Trump's speech at Davos. And yes, the EU's relationship with Canada is now strengthening. The EU has done a deal with India. I mean, I know the Mercosur thing is a little murky, but there is a lot more EU interest in Latin America than there used to be. And my personal theory is that the better way to think about all this would not be through just trade deals, but through coalitions of the willing about all kinds of things. The support for Ukraine is now, it's the European countries plus Japan and South Korea, plus now the Gulf states. It's going to be a broad coalition that are not linked together by a single political ideology. It's just like, here's the thing we all want to get done. We want to help Ukraine survive the war. We're going to work to do that. And I can imagine a lot of other problems being solved that way too. I mean, you could imagine a coalition against money laundering. You could imagine a coalition against, or in favor of, mitigating climate change. It may be that some of these things aren't done anymore through the UN or through the EU or through OAS. They're done through coalitions of countries that want to do them. And that, to me, would be the best, when I think of what Carney said, to me, that would be the way to get there.
Thank you. I'd like to hear about the risks of foreign interference in elections. We have elections in October. And when you talk about foreign interference in elections, what comes to mind is disinformation. But you mentioned CPAC, as they are using CPAC as part of not electoral.
CPAC, well, information isn't only stuff you read on the internet. You know, information comes in different ways, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, Trump or like Putin is doing it as well. They're using different tools and strategies to influence or to exert some influence in national political context and elections, like debt negotiations or tariffs.
Yep.
He used it in Argentina in the midterm elections. He just designated Petro in Colombia as member of terrorist organizations. So he's using
there's tools of U.S. foreign policy.
In a country like Brazil, how should we understand these risks of foreign interference? And are we underestimating some of them, the economic and even the symbolical endorsement that he's openly doing?
Can you wait for another?
Thank you very much. I will change the subject a bit. I was thinking the easiest way to put this question is in a negative way. Would it be possible to Trump to do all things that he's doing, this playbook of the dictator, to control the Supreme Court, to paralyze Parliament, without hate speech against women, immigrants, black people? Because we can discuss all these topics, all the possible solutions, the reasons why the political system has been a kind of dissolution of the political system without discussing these things. And then my question is, it would be possible that does this kind of thing without this.
Okay, so it's a good question. So there are two things. So first of all, about election interference, you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be information. It doesn't have to be advertising or internet stuff on the internet. The Russians were discussing the possibility of staging a fake assassination attempt on Orban as a way of building his popularity. That would be a form of intervention.
They are really creative, aren't they? Yeah. Would
Right.
So would they?
But absolutely. I mean, the U.S. sanctioning your judges is a form of is election interference, right? I mean, it's a way of intervening in Brazilian politics. I mean, it doesn't have to be a slogan. It can also be a real thing, an event, a policy, a decision. And it's perfectly possible that you will see U.S. policy towards Brazil may be designed over the next however many months it is, 9 months, 6 months, may be designed with the election in mind. I don't know that because they're different, Brazil, Trump himself seems to kind of like Lula, so, maybe he wound up liking Mamdani which was actually very funny. The whole of the American right was geared up to do a hate campaign against Mamdani and make him the face of the Democratic Party, the sort of left-wing Muslim leader. And then Trump said, I don't know, I like him, And that was, and then it was over. And you could imagine that here too. So some version of that. Maybe he doesn't like Bolsonaro, but Lula's nice. I mean, I don't know. There are all kinds of factors you have to take it. But yes, you're absolutely right. You should look not just for language, but also for actions and that kind of intervention. Your question was a bit interesting. So here's the thing about the far right. Many of the subjects that they touch on are perfectly legitimate. So in the United States, it is a legitimate question to talk about immigration. How much do we want? Should it be controlled? Who should run it? Do we really want a border fence, or is there some other solution? You could have a perfectly legitimate political conversation about immigration, but that's not why they're talking about it. They're not talking about it in order to solve the problem. So we even had, I don't know if you remember, it's very hard to remember back 2 years ago, but during the Biden administration, there was actually a Republican-led Senate bill that was designed to patrol the border and sort of end some of the problems at the border. And Trump, who was then not in office, campaigned very hard to make sure they didn't pass it because he didn't want the problem solved, because he wanted the problem to continue, because it was a useful tool for what he really wants to do, which is to create political division. And when you create political division and anger, and when you make it around issues that seem existential to people. So the way the right talks about immigration in the United States, it's a foreign invasion, and it's coming to change the nature of what America is. And we have to fight. The fight against it is so important in order to preserve the essence of who we are. And because it's so important, we can't possibly let the other side win the election. And when we win, we have to make sure they never win again. And so it's a tool of politics rather than a real issue. I mean, in the United States, as it happens, there is also a real issue. But for example, in Hungary, Viktor Orban used the issue of immigration exactly the same way, and there is no immigration issue in Hungary. There is no mass immigration to Hungary. Nobody wanted to immigrate there. The people who did try to immigrate there, they actually have a problem with emigration. They have a big problem with people leaving the country. And the immigrants that they have got mostly have gone to Hungary in order to get to Germany, And so it's a very peculiar, but Orban used it. There was even a famous, I don't know if you remember this it was back in 2015-16 when there was the wave of immigrants from Syria. Orban put these huge posters all over the country. Dear immigrants, respect the laws of Hungary, pick up your trash, behave well when you're here in our country. Enormous billboards in Hungarian. So who speaks Hungarian outside of the Hungarians? I wrote a book about Hungary. I'm very pro-Hungarian. I didn't mean to sound insulting, but the point is the billboards weren't directed at the immigrants. They were directed at Hungarians. As a way of creating anger at these foreigners who were here leaving trash around and not obeying the law. And so they use these issues as wedge issues to divide people and to create a feeling of existential crisis that requires dramatic and radical solutions. And so I think actually those issues are totally central and necessary to what it is that they do. Because those are the things people, why is the trans issue so central? Trans issue is it doesn't involve mass numbers of people, especially this thing about trans people in sports. I just think I said this to you today, there are 150,000 college athletes in the United States. There were maybe 9 or 10 who were trans one way or the other. There was one who had any significance as a national athlete. There was a woman, a swimmer. So it's not an issue that affects hundreds of millions of American voters, but it was made into a central issue because there were people for whom the idea that men can become women or women can become men feels like an existential threat. And so it became the issue. I think it was one of the most important issues in the 2024 campaign. So the answer is yes, these issues are really necessary to what they do. It's like the hate speech that's what they do to create the momentum that they need to make this institutional assault.
One last question, Bruno.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you. It's a pleasure hearing you. I'll go with the short version of my 2 questions. I remember 2 weeks ago or 1 year ago or whatever, we are setting plans in company, and they're trying to define what will happen with the Trump administration. And we have this expression, the taco expression, which is Trump always chickens out. Mm-hmm. And something changed in the way that he did Venezuela, Iran, etc. What drives me to the following question: what happened after Trump's mandate? Trump is a consequence of a shift of geopolitical, geoeconomics change in the world, the cultural shift, Islam, this shift with China. So what's your view about what happened next?
What happens next? Well, I'll just get out my crystal ball and I'll look at this. Look, I mean, I think this is the end is a lot of damage done to the reputation of the United States as a reliable ally to countries that depended on it, as a reliable partner to countries who traded with the US. I mean, you could imagine a president coming next who sought to repair all of that, and maybe that, I wouldn't exclude that happening, but I don't think we go back to the moment we were in, where the US felt like the one necessary part, you know, the power that we needed, that around which a lot of other things happened. I think this conversation between middle powers has become more important in the meantime, and it's still not clear to me, again, the damage done to universities, to knowledge, to science, to the federal government, to the bureaucracy, including to the sort of knowledge parts of the bureaucracy. I mean, the people who regulate air pollution, you know, or air traffic control. I mean, some of that damage will continue to have longer term effects. And I think it'll make the US a weaker country in the future, with maybe for better. I don't know, from your point of view, maybe that's better, but either for better or for worse. So I don't think we go back to where we were before. I mean, you know, after Julius Caesar fell, well, was murdered, in fact, Rome didn't go back to being a republic. You know, there are things that become broken and don't get fixed. So, which I say without necessarily meaning negative. It's not that we can't have America be a democracy again. I mean, that could very well happen. It's just that it won't. You know, we don't go back to there's a lot of nostalgia for, I don't know, the 1990s. I don't think we're going back there. We'll go into some new phase where the U.S. plays a different kind of role. That's the best I can say.
Anne, you've
Thank you.
covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you for good questions. Thanks for your excellent questions.